So today we're going to be looking at percent and estimation. And what we really want to see if we can do is, can we estimate percents by using fractions and decimals? I'm going to show you both ways on how you can do that. All right, so let's look at our real world situation here. It says suppose 200 people are surveyed to find out how they learn to play an instrument. The results are shown in the table below. So private lessons, all right, there are actually 42% of people who get their lessons privately. So do we need to know 42% exactly? Sometimes we don't. Sometimes we can make an estimation. In this case, we'll estimate that to 40% because that's an easy number for us to find. And what is that as a fraction? Well, remember, a percent means per 100. So 40% is actually 40 out of 100, which reduces down to 2/5. All right. So how many get their lessons at school? Well, 32% get their lessons at school, which is about, if we were to estimate that, I'd make that 30%. Well, what's 30% as a fraction? Well, that's 30 per 100, which reduces down to 3/10. All right. And then lastly, the self-taught section, that's 26% of people. Well, let's round that down to a nice easy 25%. And what's 25%? Well, that's a quarter. So that's 1/4. An easy one. Okay, so we can see how if we can round these percentages to easier numbers, then they become pretty simple for us to turn into fractions. You can even do it in your head a lot of times. All right, so it says estimate each percent. Choose an estimate that can be represented by a fraction that is easy to use. Then write each estimated percent as a fraction in simplest form, which is exactly what we just did. Number 2 says about how many people took lessons at school. Well, if we look up here, all right, there were 32% of people who took lessons at school. All right, we said, well, we can round that to about 30%, which is 3 out of 10. Well, remember in the original problem, it says suppose 200 people are surveyed. So that means 3/10 of that 200. So we want to ask ourselves 3/10 of 200 is what? Well, let's just add some zeros to our fraction here. 3/10 is the same as 30 over 100. Well, if 30 out of 100, we have 200, so that must mean there are 60 people. So there are about 60 people who took lessons at school. Number 3 says Sarah estimates the percent of people who taught themselves to play an instrument as 25%. And then she found 1/4 of 200. Would her answer be less than or greater than the actual number of people who were self-taught? Explain. Well, they would be less than. The reason for that is because go all the way back to our estimation. All right. If we go back up here to our estimation, all right, we saw that the actual percentage was 26%, and we rounded that down to 25%. So if we round down to 25%, then our actual number of people will be less than the actual percentage. So it has to do with our rounding the percentage down will cause our estimate to be slightly lower than the actual. And that's really just a matter of common sense when you think about it. So estimate the percent of a number. It says sometimes an exact answer is not needed when using percents. One way to estimate the percent of a number is to use a fraction. Another method for estimating the percent of a number is to first find 10% of the number and then multiply. So 70% equals 7 times 10% of a number. Or you could think about 70% as being 7 groups of 10%. And you're adding them. How many up to now? I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 7. So 7 groups of 10% is your 70% in that particular case. All right, so we're going to look at both methods. We're going to look at converting to a fraction and multiplying, and then we'll look at finding what 10% of something is, and then just seeing how many of those 10% we have. So in our first example, it says Jody has paid 62% of the $500 she owes for her loan. So estimate 62% of 500. So what we're going to do is we're going to start out by saying, well, we don't really need 62%. That's kind of about 60%, right? Yeah, 60%. All right. Well, what's 60% as a fraction? Well, that would be 60 per 100. All right. We can get rid of our zeros. That gives us 6/10. So that'll reduce down to 3/5. So we're actually trying to find out what's 3/5 of our 500. All right. What's our 3/5 of our 500? Okay. Well, we find that by multiplying. And I'll make this a fraction just to make it easier on myself. All right. And I can actually bring this guy up to 500 and this guy up to 300, playing with equivalent fractions. And then check this out. We can reduce this to 1 and 1, and then multiply and get 300 over 1, which is 300. So there's one method you can use. Let's look at using that 10% method that I had mentioned above. This is actually my favorite method, and I think this is one you'll like as well. So it says Marita and four of her friends ordered a pizza that cost $14.72. She is responsible for 20% of the bill. About how much money will she need to pay? So the first thing we want to do is say, all right, we're looking for 20% of the bill. Let's just find 10% first, because 10% is actually really easy to find. If you want to know what 10% of any number is, all you're going to do is find the decimal point, which is right here, and we're going to slide it to the left one place. So 10% of $15 is $1.50. So 10% of that $15 is $1.50. Let me make a little note that this is 10%. Okay? Well, how many groups of 10% do we need in this problem? Since we have 20%, we need 2 of them. So I'm going to take 2 times my $1.50, and that's going to easily give me $3. So Marita is responsible for $3 of the bill. So the same process can work for percents greater than 100 or less than 1. All right, it says you can also estimate percents of a number when the percent is greater than 100 or less than 1. And let's look at how this works. So example 3, we want to estimate 122% of 50. So first of all, 122%, bleh. Let's make that 120%, just because that's easier for estimating purposes. And then I want you to think about it this way. Instead of having 120%, what if it is 100% and 20%? Think about it that way, because those are easier numbers to figure out. What's 100% of 50? Well, if we have all 100% of it, it must be 50. And then we ask ourselves, well, what's 20% of 50? Well, remember, if we have 50 and we want 10% of it, find that decimal point, slide it over one spot. That's 5, right? So 5 is our 10%. Well, we want not 10% but 20%, so that would be double 5, so 2 times 5, which gives me 10. So 20% of 50 is an additional 10. And then I'm just going to add 50 and 10, and that gives me 60. So about 122% of 50 is about, of 50 is about 60, a little bit more than what we started with. So it makes sense. So let's look at a situation where we have a percent that's less than even 1%. So it's a fraction of a percent, which can be a little bit trickier. All right. So let's say there are 789 seventh graders at Washington Middle School. About 1/4 of a percent of the seventh grade students have traveled overseas. What is the approximate number of seventh grade students that have traveled overseas? Explain. Okay, so remember, we have 1/4 of a percent. Now that's not 25%. That's not a quarter. That's a quarter of 1%. So you could also think about it as 0.25%. That's another way to think about it. All right, so it's a really, really small amount. So let's make things easy for ourselves before we overthink them. All right, so first of all, if we've got a quarter of a percent, that's pretty close to 1%. So let's start with 1%. And then 789 is about 800 students. So let's start with 1% of 800. All right. So remember how I told you it's really easy to find 10% of a number? You just find the decimal point right here and you slide it to the left one place, and that gives you 10% of a number. Well, finding 1% of a number is just as easy, because we're actually just going to take that decimal point, slide it one more place to the left. So 1% of 800, we slide that decimal 2 places to the left, suddenly becomes 8. All right, it suddenly becomes 8. All right, so now we know 1% of 800 is 8. Well, we don't want 1%, we want a quarter of a percent. All right, so what we're going to do, since we want 1/4 of that, a quarter of that 1%, we'll just multiply 1/8 by 1/4, all right, which is the same, as we talked about in class, as doing 8 divided by 4. And 8 divided by 4 is 2. So 1/4 of a percent of 789 is about 2 students. All right, so let's do one more of these fractional percents. All right, so it says last year 639 students attended a summer camp. Of those who attended this year, 0.5% also attended summer camp last year. About how many students attended the summer camp 2 years in a row? Okay, so let's start out, rather than finding 0.5% right away, let's focus on 1%. And 1% of what? Well, we have 1% of 639. So remember, we said really easy way to find 1%, find the decimal, which is right here. I'm going to slide it to the left, 2 places for 1%. So that's going to give me 6.39, which is about 6. Remember, we're making estimates, so we can make some rounding decisions here. All right, so that becomes about 6. Well, remember, we wanted 0.5% when we started, not just that 1%. Well, how much is 0.5% of 1%? Well, it's half. So we could do 6 times 1/2, or 6 divided by 2, which in either case gives us 3. So about how many students attended the summer camp 2 years in a row? About 3 students. All right, so you guys are going to do the guided practice for tonight, and then we will talk about that tomorrow morning. Thanks, guys.